Afternoon, everyone. Rich Schreiber here with Tom Martin, and this is True Journalism. In 1945, the government blocked a single company from owning many radio stations because they called it a monopoly on the mind. Today, the ink is drying on a deal that puts CBS and CNN, the two pillars of American broadcast history, under the control of a private group with direct loyalty to the White House, and what this means from a news perspective. You won't see a government agent sitting in the newsroom, but you don't need one when the owner has the president's cell number on speed dial. This isn't a merger, it's an acquisition of the truth itself. Tom, over to you.
I'm definitely interested in discussing this. I've worked at both CBS News and CNN, and not to sound like an old timer or whatever, I appreciate it when some old friends of mine talk about the Edward R. Murrow days or Cronkite or even Dan Rather for that matter. So there are changes underway. It's concerning.
And it's interesting, Tom, that for 40 years, we were taught, even beginning back in journalism school, which was, I don't want to go there, but a few years back, we were taught that news was like a loss leader to television stations and networks. It was something that networks ran for prestige and as a public service. Exactly. Even though they ended up being loss leaders, they didn't make money. But those days, of course, are gone, because what we're now seeing is the state media model, where newsrooms aren't just businesses anymore. And of course, we know in the 1990s, many of the news outlets were acquired by major corporations, and then sponsors and editorial control was under siege because newsrooms were now held kind of accountable for the sponsors. And the famous instances where 60 Minutes was denied running a story that was critical of one of their big sponsors. And I'm sure there are other instances.
Well,
So today,
I apologize for interrupting, but I just want to say I think it's important to remember that we can chart the alarm on a spectrum. I belong to a number of these groups on Facebook and LinkedIn about CBS alumni and all of that kind of thing. And I came across one post the other day, maybe it was even yesterday, a guy who was a member of the Atlanta bureau of CBS News. And it's logical to think that a major national news organization should have offices in New York, LA, Chicago, Atlanta,
the big markets.
Only that. And he said, when Larry Tisch came in, again, I was there during those days. This was the mid 1980s. I was caught in two different, lay off 200 people, lay off 300 people. Hey, I'm doing, I think, a great job, young assistant producer or whatever. And I just couldn't resist posting. There's like, he was the original, Larry Tisch, owner of Lowe's Hotels, was the original My Pillow guy. And so there's always been that commercial interest, that factor. And so whether the people in charge and who lead the board of directors, the investors, are willing to accept, like you just said, that it's a civic responsibility, or just say, no, guys, it's the bottom line. But that kind of debate has always been part of it for decades now, really.
Yeah, the bottom line aspect I can understand. There was an old saying that a business deal that loses money is a bad business deal. And regardless, you should try to avoid that. So it's not surprising that at some point in a capitalist society that people started to, and Larry Tisch being one of the forerunners, started to realize that news has to make money like any other part of the business. But I think what we're seeing today is that news organizations are now becoming political assets. They're no longer just money makers. And we know that they obviously generate a lot of revenue. We know that Fox and MSN, MS Now are very profitable, and it's a ratings game. It's a battle over viewership. And we know how that's affected the journalism tone in these stations. But now we've taken it one step further, whereas we always knew Fox News was particularly aligned with a conservative voice, MSNBC on the other side. But now they've gone one step further. And I think this happened over the last election process, where many people accused Fox News as essentially being a propaganda engine for Donald Trump. And of course, they paid that landmark $800 million fine or settlement to that foreign company that built all the voting machines that they persistently attacked as being part of Dominion voting machines, which was totally disproven. And because Fox News chose to parrot the Trump line, sinker, what is it, hook and sinker. In particular, one of their news anchors who ultimately lost his job over that, who's now an interesting character running his own podcast, getting lots of eyes, and that's Tucker Carlson, who's actually become a bit of a thorn, ironically, in the Trump MAGA administration, being very critical of Israel and the Epstein files more recently, ironically. Don't know if he got a conscience or if it just makes good sense from viewership standpoint to
I think Congress leader actually, but
yeah.
No, I don't know. And with our president currently upset with 2 of the 3 justices who he installed on the Supreme Court in recent days, I wouldn't be surprised the way Fox News is the audition ground for cabinet secretaries and what have you. I wouldn't be surprised to see Judge Jeanine Pirro there on the Supreme Court.
We laugh over that, but it's not, unfortunately, a funny time. And as journalists, again, we both went through the Nixon era. We know that the Justice Department, even though they were complicit, I think, in some of the cover-up, but the 3 houses of government, the three pillars of government, managed to hold up during those times, and in fact were instrumental in effectively forcing Nixon out. This time, of course, we know that's not the case. And we also know, on top of that, there's no Washington Post, or what's left of it, after a third of the employees got laid off recently by Jeff Bezos.
Exactly. I mean, again, I don't know if our audience will be interested in this. I thought it was significant, but I often look at the homepage of the New York Times at the end of the night or whatever, and came across an article that they ran a day or 2 ago that said that the book section of the Washington Post has been killed, part of that massive layoffs by Jeff Bezos. I lived in Washington, D.C. for many years, got my start there in the news business there in Washington, so on, went to college there. And I grew up in a family that really appreciated books. I still appreciate books. But just to continue the dumbing down of the population, some people say, oh, that's an elitist luxury, or okay. But it's sad to see developments like that.
I see. So reading a book is an elitist proposition. Meanwhile, our declining academic scores, where has that led us? We're 36th in the world now in academic standards, which is ludicrous, and which is largely the reason why a lot of Americans, people joke about the average American can't name the 50 states or can't name the 3 branches of government and things like that. That's not a joke. That's a reality. And to characterize people who do know the answer to that as elitist, no. We just paid attention in school. We just got a good education.
Most of the people who know the answers to those questions are now being evicted from our nation.
The irony of that is, Tom, as you probably know, is the immigrant part of our nation, those who have gotten their immigration status or their citizenship, know more about America and its mechanisms than our own citizens. That's a cautionary tale when just being informed is labeled as being elitist, because that's another part of this dumbing down that you talk about. And it's no matter what your political leanings are, and we're not here to talk about them, being informed and making an informed decision is your inalienable right. Don't give that up by falling victim to demagoguery and sound bites on any media, left or right.
Absolutely.
We're here to tell you, make an informed decision. That is your duty as an American citizen, just like jury duty and other things, right? If you show up for jury duty, you're supposed to make an informed decision based on the facts and ask questions. That's how you should be approaching your news consumption, in the same way you do jury duty.
Yeah.
Enough of my soapbox for today. But what were some of the feelings going, because I know you're an avid CNN watcher, and as have I been. Who hasn't? We talked about the fact that they were the first cable news network invited to actually appear at a war. George H.W. Bush invited CNN to basically film the entire original Gulf War, the first Gulf War, which is an example of where the government and the news, in this case, the CNN, were basically working in collaboration.
Yeah. I remember back in the early 1980s, again, I was just getting started then. Actually, when I wrote about this I wrote about that. Maybe I just posted on Facebook. I should write a Substack essay about this. But when I was like my first year getting started in the TV news business, I was working there in the Washington bureau and we were bringing people to sit in the chair, connect with the New York Broadcast Center to be interviewed for a middle of the night show called Night Watch, which
Oh, yes.
I tell you all this is because that was the early days when programming was beginning to expand and starting again in the early 1980s. And one night, the security guard at the front desk called upstairs and said, "There's a guy here. He says he's here for an interview. Don't think we have anyone on the schedule tonight." I went down and it was Jesse Jackson. And of course, no one told Jesse Jackson no. He wanted to be interviewed. I'm here to be interviewed. And we damn well interviewed. It was a fun experience meeting that great man. I do remember when CNN was starting up, and it's interesting, a few minutes ago, you and I were talking about commercial pressures and they're understandable and so on. Let's think back. CNN was born from the vision of Ted Turner, a billboard business based in Atlanta. So there was a commercial business and he felt the calling to do something bigger for the people. And if you remember way back when, it was very internationally oriented and they had like global peace initiatives and maybe some people like, who the hell are you to do things like this? But you have to give Ted Turner credit for
Absolutely.
the commercial dollars and cents bottom line to have create something like that. It's interesting.
Yeah, Ted Turner was a visionary, as we all know. And in addition, he founded obviously TBS, TNT, and the Superstation in Atlanta, which became the springboard for CNN. And yeah, he really made the transition from local news. Of course, we had network news, but to 24/7 cable news. And it all started from his studio in Atlanta, TBS. Yeah. WTBS in Atlanta, Georgia. But what do you
it's hard to say. I just wanted to throw in again to 99% of me is inclined not to like the new leader of CBS News, who's brought in by the Ellison family and fired a lot of people and wants to bring in some opinion pundits and so on. But when she led an all-staff meeting recently, she said, we need to evolve with the times. And I know you and I have been writing for Substack. She came out in that Substack world. And so it's true that the world of media and information and technology obviously is evolving. So part of me understands that. I don't like the thoughts and the positions and all of the baggage that goes along with it. But, perhaps it was inevitable that a station that started with, or a network that started with William Paley from the cigar company, or 190 years later, is going to have some changes. I don't know. I hate to see things change too much, but
the more things change, the more they stay the same. In the news business, there are certain guidelines and protocols that have traditionally been followed. And I'm not sure what bringing up the modern day aspect of news is. I think that's just another word game around positioning the editorial content of the network, unfortunately, to be more consistent with the political element.
Alternate truth. Which truth do you want?
And even though Kellyanne Conway said there are alternate facts, we know that's not quite the case. But I mean, the word truth is a consequence of our beliefs and our bias. There are many truths. So if she had said there are alternate truths, that would be a correct statement, but not alternate facts. And in fact, I did an analysis of President Trump's speech, State of the Nation speech, purely from a data point standpoint. And there were 28 specific data points, statistics that he cited in his presentation, anything from the number of immigrants to the price of goods, the impact on tariffs, etc. Out of 28 data points, all but 2 were either untrue or exaggerated. The only 2 that he got right was the price of eggs and the fact that Charlie Kirk was assassinated. Everything else was an exaggeration or a dead-on untrue. Even things like inflation. Inflation under Joe Biden hit 9.1% at its highest. Yes, that's awful. But it was 14% on Ronald Reagan. Okay, and by the time Trump took office, it was 3.1%. So Joe Biden's administration had already cycled through inflation by the time he handed it off to Donald Trump. It's again, these are, you could check the facts. Don't believe me. These are the facts, babe. You can look it up yourself. As I think there was a famous journalist who said that. But I wanted to circle back to CNN because I know you've had a lot of, I know that you didn't work there necessarily, but knew many of the journalists,
Yes,
producers.
I worked there for a couple of years. We started the internet movement. That's like 98 through
Oh, okay.
2001. CNN Financial News, actually.
Then I stand corrected. Were you with Lou Dobbs? Was he there at that time?
I actually moved into his office when he moved somewhere else. They had an office there near Grand Central Station. It's at Hudson Yards or something like that.
But CNN, because they were the first and because they were created by Ted Turner, and the idea was to be a 24/7 public service for America. And you can argue whether or not it was overkill or whatnot, but they set the early standard for reporting. And
There's also, just in speaking of the fairness doctrine and equal time, there is an aspect of CNN. I still watch CNN quite extensively, I guess you probably not, but there's one aspect of it every once in a while does drive me crazy. Back in the, I think, late 80s, I spent a year working for CNN just down the hall from Larry King in Washington, D.C. for a show. I don't remember the show called Crossfire that had
you can.
written his book about it.
Yeah.
And so that was like the first show where you have people yelling at one another. I also got to know William F. Buckley because I, for some reason, was very intrigued with him and brought him in to be interviewed by Charlie Rose quite a lot. I worked for that Crossfire show at CNN for a year. And so these days when I hear people yelling at one another, I can't even hear what's going on, or when CNN feels somewhat obligated to bring on an extreme right winger here. It's like, so I don't know.
Yeah, but that's a great point because, and then I remembered another show that I used to watch religiously in the 80s and 90s and even 2000s that was run by David Brinkley. And it was on Sunday morning. And it had Sam Donaldson, who obviously was a famous reporter who had the nerve to stand up Ronald Reagan with questions. He was Cokie Roberts, I think, ultimately succeeded David Brinkley. David Brinkley, the longtime anchor for Channel 4 back in the days, even of
Monthly reports, yes.
which I remember as a kid. But they also had a conservative voice on there named George Will, who I happen to a lot because he was very grounded, very eloquent, obviously, incredible writer, still is. But I also found most of what he said was fact-based, and even though I didn't necessarily agree with him, I found it very difficult to not appreciate the fact that on balance, he was fair-minded. And as time went along, he was critical of the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, because they did not espouse true conservative values. They called him out on it. And of course, he has plenty to talk about with the current regime because they're anything but conservative. But it was good to see that there was this balance. And the exchanges that he had with Sam Donaldson and on the show at times got a little rancorous, but they were always respectful. And in the end, one side or the other kind of agreed or were able to part as friends kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. If I remember correctly, and if he's still around, I saw something, he was interviewed recently or something like that, George Will. But if I remember correctly, he always and he would come into CBS News there in Washington every once in a while to be.
Yeah.
But if I remember correctly, he, like Doris Kearns Goodwin or somebody like that, he was grounded and she's more of a pure historian, but George Will would ground his points in history.
Yes.
Like a lot of quote unquote commentators and analysts like just thrown that out the window now. Like we're totally from any reference to that. It's just terrible. And then you used the R word, respect. And I was just offended by the recent Attorney General Pam Bondi hearing. I'm a social media addict, I must admit. So I found a couple of people doing parodies of that. If you went on a blind with the woman who said, "Excuse me," or "You were." So what kind of hearing was them? That was just...
It was a spectacle for sure. And I know my wife and I like to follow you on social media. There are doctors who monitor those proceedings and actually can interpret the body language, the facial expressions. And I told my wife, I always feel sorry for Pam Bondi, my wife, who is a Republican, who voted for George Bush twice and is a woman, a feisty woman. says, don't you dare feel sorry for her. She made the bed that she's in and slept in. And even though you could tell from she was ready to just scream like a primal scream in that meeting. She took a lot of heavy hits on both sides. It wasn't just partisan Democrat stuff. Obviously, there were a few Democrats that were really vociferous. One from California, I know, and Jasmine Crockett spent her 5 minutes reading basically a laundry list of all of Pam Bondi's misgivings, and every single one was factual. But again, I felt sorry for the fact that our institution has gone so far so far in the wrong direction that this kind of spectacle would happen. First of all, yeah, you, the many things that happened that Pam Bondi did not address. There's an old saying, you reap what you sow. It really was very disheartening as an American, and certainly an American who respects journalism and respects the government process, to see something like that. And I think that's a consequence of a lot of players in this current administration. Kash Patel has been caught out on the carpet for his misgivings lately with downing a jet that could have been used to possibly stave off a school massacre, showing up in the locker room of the men's hockey team while taxpayers paid for his trip there. Of course, lying under oath in front of a that same congressional hearing, which under normal circumstances would have resulted in his immediate impeachment. Clearly, and this is not meant to be a political statement. This is a total breakdown in who we are as Americans being played out right in front of us on the press. And this kind of fodder, I know, is it's not good for the nation. It's great for eyeballs. It's great. Same thing with this persistent Jeffrey Epstein story. I hope and pray someday we do get to resolution on that. And I'll just say that it doesn't matter who is ultimately tried and convicted on whatever those crimes are. And one of the analogies that I drew a little while ago is people in the government, people who did these kinds of things, should remember the Nuremberg trials and remember how I was only following orders was punishable even by death back in 1947, thanks to the Nuremberg trials. And there will be a day where people who have done what they've done will be held accountable. And, that I believe that's God's will. And what concerns me is what the media will do with that. And I'm sure they're licking their chops on both sides. It's that reality would be the media event of a lifetime. And unfortunately, that kind of takes away from what the purpose should be, which is accountability, not the media getting an incredible windfall from TV ratings.
I was enjoying you might not like this comment, but I always enjoyed the comedy of George Carlin, and I met in a computer shop, and so we had a little conversation, which was fun. But he had lines like, we should take one of those square states like Kansas and fence it in and just put all the people there, or have Friday night executions. Like, you're reverent, that's you offend my sensibilities, but it's just, I know what you mean. There are people out there salivating for, will that be great media?
If and when it does happen, and again, if we are a nation that treasures our democracy, the rule of law, and those kinds of things, it will happen. It's unfortunate that it happened. Being of German descent, I remember the Nuremberg trials, studied it. I wouldn't give my people any slack. I was only following orders. No, you had a moral obligation. You could have said no. And same thing with all of those powerful people that were on Jeffrey Epstein's island. The interesting part of that, and the last statement I'll say about that, is as we see more and more unravel with that, it's almost like the pedophilia was the education, that was the entertainment. The real things that were going on there were the power broking, between nations, between power
artist formerly known as Prince Andrew, who was revealing pivotal
state secrets.
trade secrets.
Exactly. And back and forth with certainly other people across the aisle. It's unfortunate that, in a nutshell, the media benefits from these kinds of catastrophic events that tear at the very fiber and heart and soul of America. And that, dialing back again to, if this were CNN 30 years ago, I don't get the feeling that's how it would be reported, because it should be reported with some soberness and not, of course, how we know that it will be. How would you acknowledge the tone being at CNN years ago has changed and modified with CNN over the years?
It did take a more, I'm not even sure what adjectives to use, but a more statesman-like demeanor where there's a sense of responsibility. Again, think back to Bernie Shaw and then Edward Arnett and people like that. It's like they were Edward R. Murrow, I think.
Yeah.
I still think that Christian Amanpour has some of those qualities. I'm not going to go into the gutter. And the others are not terrible, but things have changed. And actually, I remember a slight pivot that I remember. I like Anderson Cooper very much, but I remember vividly when half my family comes from New Orleans on my mother's side. And so I remember when Anderson Cooper went down there to cover Hurricane Katrina, and he was saying the government needs to be more involved, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, wow, here's a news anchor who's like taking a stand and he's telling us his thoughts. So it's like things are 50. It was perhaps very appropriate. And it wasn't really pushing the political agenda too much, but it was like, wow, that's so unusual to be hearing that. And that's why maybe it was a little before your time and my time. I think we were kids at the time. But when they said Walter Cronkite suggested that America has lost the Vietnam War, that's when things began to change. We better get out of Vietnam. The fact that you would have like a guarded statement going out a little bit on a limb, now it's like crazy.
Right. But as you recall, and you mentioned this in the past, it was Edward R. Murrow that had a big hand in getting Joseph McCarthy, essentially that whole part of our history to move on.
I thought that play, and I think that was before our time. We're old enough now, but I think that was before 50s. But I thought I did see the telecast of George Clooney's "Good Night and Good Luck" and I thought that, a very interesting dynamic where, I don't know if it was William Paley, but he was saying, we really need to keep doing this story. And he wasn't saying this will really screw us with advertising or something, but there was that kind of discussion. It wasn't just a no-brainer. So it was,
oh, yeah. Even back then, even I remember in the 60s and 70s, the editorial position of news statements and news stations and networks, when they crossed the line, still there were rebuttals from the government, maybe not so much from advertisers until 60 Minutes started going after the tobacco industry and a lot of institutions and bad agents. Then CBS started to feel pressure from advertisers, but they always seemed to be above that up until, I don't know, just recently.
it's
For sure.
it's, yeah.
And you mentioned the fairness doctrine. It was interesting. I went back and reviewed what that was, and it was originally passed in 1949 and by the FCC, and it required broadcast license holders to present controversial issues of public importance in a balanced manner. And it was rooted in the scarcity rationale, which you and I both know from our dabbling in the personal development space. The idea is because back then, broadcast frequencies were a limited public resource, and those granted a license had to really serve the people and meet certain public interest standards rather than their own private viewpoints.
Yeah.
But in the 80s, when things started to open up, the Reagan administration said, no, it's no longer really a scarcity mindset. We've got more media outlets, more newspapers, television, radio stations. There are more people that are able to espouse all the different opinions and whatnot. We no longer should be throttling back or inhibiting stations to the sense that they can only represent this one view or this one viewpoint, or that they're not able to opinionate and do these other things. So in 1987, the fairness doctrine was abolished. The Congress attempted to reinstate it, but President Reagan vetoed the legislation. And that's really been widely seen, as we've talked before, as the turning point in the American media and spawned a whole host of ideological, opinion-driven radio stations. Obviously, Rush Limbaugh probably the most, and a lot of those came from the conservative side because most of the media outlets up until the 80s were predominantly owned by certain liberal-leaning news people and people in that sense. So,
Yeah. You might call it the Goodfellas FCC era or something like that.
yeah, it's hard to say. They're at this point, whatever the FCC used to be, they're not fulfilling that role anymore, clearly. So yeah, so that the elimination of the fairness doctrine spawned all of the talk radio and all of the opinion making and all of the demagoguery that's now pretty evident on all really news media, not just one or the
Would you
other.
agree that quashing that Stephen Colbert's interview with that Texas candidate really, I think it backfired a little.
No, it did, because he ended up getting, what, 5 or 6 million views on YouTube when he did do the interview. I don't know if that's the same as his late night audience. Probably not. But yeah, he was able to still have the interview done, and most of us who saw it thought it was effective, and also thought it was a total misuse. Ironically, what they were trying to do, the other side, was use elements of the fairness doctrine, equal time, which are no longer a factor. How can you insist on equal time when you have all these podcasters and all these people all over the place where none of that is tracked, where none of that is reported on? It was a disingenuous kind of application of a law that had already been repealed, and quite shocking that people on a certain side of the fence actually use that wording against CBS. That's another thing that we're seeing today, I think, in aspects of journalism is there's a lot of spin and there's a lot of positioning that goes on, and the lines between news reporting and opinion have been blurred, as we know, for so long that it's difficult. And then on top of that, we've always talked about how the truth and the fact-based elements that the news used to represent are pretty much under siege.
It's true. It's true. It's an interesting time. I appreciate that we get to share conversations like this, because hopefully for our audience who may not have heard about some of the aspects that we're covering here, they might dig into it a little bit deeper and notice that these things are going on. It's like you mentioned how we're both interested in the personal development movement. That's how we met years ago. And I've heard so many coaches and speakers and seminar leaders say, don't listen to the news. It's so depressing. Your anxiety will skyrocket. And I can't imagine not listening to the news. That seems irresponsible. So far better to put it in perspective and be like a critical consumer, an educated consumer.
An educated consumer, yeah. A note to Cy Sims, rest his soul. But no, you're right about that. I think it is a tremendous responsibility that to look at the news with a fact-based, unbiased, and even-handed point of view. And it's difficult. We all have our own beliefs. We all have our own value system. We all have our own bias, and in particular, unconscious bias. No matter what we try to do, we're still looking at the news from within our own filters. But if you just look at it from the standpoint of, geez, there is another side to this, right? And there's nothing wrong with me trying to understand that, because that will give me more clarity, perhaps, on my side of the equation. It's like the one thing in society, last point on this, that's really, we can't have debates anymore, right? Remember back in high school, you put your hand in a hat, pick out a little strip of paper that said you're supposed to have a debate on this, and you take one side, the other person takes another side.
What led, I was very involved as one of these nerdish high school debaters in Miami in the 70s, and that led me to Georgetown University. And it was the number one collegiate debate program in America. I think the head of that program moderated, maybe not moderated, but helped organize the first Kennedy-Nixon debate, which was so legendary. But again, as said, you'd have four rounds at a debate tournament every day, maybe 3 days in a row at Yale or Harvard or something. Okay, you're the affirmative. Your proposition is such and such a topic, put forth a plan. And they're like, oh shit, what are we going to say? I mean, it was very good. I guess it was great preparation for government. If you can just pick a side and just go to town and hear arguments, I think my son would be great at that.
But to be a great debater, the paradox is you have to be a great listener, because you have to listen to the other side's viewpoint and listen for the access points and where and what they say that give you the opportunity to run counterpoint. If all you're doing is demagoguery and just forcing your own opinion on somebody, that's not debating.
That's right. That's
And
true.
it's not even effective. And that's, to your point, what we hear predominantly on the airwaves today. So,
I totally agree.
Yes, sir.
but hopefully we will get beyond that. I guess we'll wrap up here as good as any point. I'm Richard Schreiber, and by the way, law firm AI expert behind me. I'm an AI strategist and consultant helping law firms and small businesses to automate and use solutions to give them back their time and better their bottom lines. And it's been a pleasure and my honor and privilege this week. And Tom, who are you?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, no, I'm active in the public relations field these days. Again, I spent my first 20 years as a media guy with these different television networks and so on, and then pivoted into PR. And I really, after listening to what we just discussed, you might feel, oh my gosh, this is a terrible time to express my opinion, and maybe I should just lie low. But the fact is, I really believe this is a great time to get your opinions out there, because there's a lot of change, and the conversational marketplace is rich with opportunity right now. And I help people get their books out and their voices out, and that's what I love to do.
And I know you pick projects for people who are informed and not likely going to participate in harmful
propaganda. So I've had people say you should become a political.
That's the easy way out. It's more challenging and difficult to do what we do, and that's to try to understand things from a more fair-minded.
Wonderful people that want to make a difference and their hearts are in the right place, so they can really help others with their lives. I love being around people like that. I know you're all about that as well.
Indeed. And I know you have an upcoming coaching series and class coming up on PR. So we'll drop that information in our notes here. And as well, I have a class that I'm teaching to help small to medium-sized lawyers to identify some of the areas in their business that are bogging them down time-wise, and we can help them out with the better solutions. So until next time, have a wonderful afternoon, evening, or whatever it may be, and I'll throw it to Tom to close us out with Ed Murrow.
Exactly. As Ed always said, good night and good luck.
Yes, indeed. Goodbye, everybody.